Hello, I'm Robert, and this time I want to talk about this idea that when I die, that's it, which scientists often bring up, and they think they proved that, many scientists. Of course, many who are also Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, or whatever, who don't think this way at all. But I've come into many discussions with scientists who think that they have even a watertight argument. They even think that the people who think in other ways are illogical and irrational. And they have such a firm belief in this, they don't even realise they have a belief. They just think that everyone else is being silly. And so, and the way this argument goes is that they say that the consciousness is tied up in the brain. That's what they believe. Now that is their belief. And that when you die, then the brain rots. Of course it does, everyone agrees on that. And so they say, since the brain rots, then your consciousness sort of rots away as well. The consciousness disappears when you die. And that is not a scientific argument. The reason it's not a scientific argument is because they don't know what consciousness is. They can't weigh it. They can't say that it's got a charge, or that it's. They can't say where it is. They can't say whether it's a single mathematical point or it's got some extension. They can't say if it's got a volume or a surface area, and they can't say if it's got some mass, or if it consists of particles that move at the speed of light, or that are stationary, or that are moving at certain speeds. They have no explanation at all of what this consciousness is. And yet they feel they can lay down the law and say that this consciousness is tied into your brain, and then when you die, this consciousness goes away. And that's not a scientific way of proceeding. You can't use science to prove things about when you don't even know what they are. And there's no experiment you can do. They haven't managed to find out anything about this consciousness that they're so gladly saying that when you die it's gone. The only place in which it does occur in science is as the observer in quantum mechanics. And there's no detailed explanation of what it is. It is just said that you have an observer who, when he does an experiment, then has to collapse into a particular state. But what an observer is not explained at all. It's taken as a kind of primitive idea that you have to have in order to understand quantum mechanics. But scientists don't know what an observer is. It's just assumed that you understand it. I mean, as a cat an observer are all human beings observer? Could there be some humans who aren't? And for some reason, when they do these experiments, it doesn't behave in a quantum mechanical fashion. It doesn't seem likely, but they just don't. They don't have any explanation as yet as to how that all works. So then a few ways into this to try and get you to try and think that perhaps it's not as clear cut as you think. So first of all, there's the scientists have the idea. I think I'll start off with the whole idea of the brain as a program, because that is so underwrites a lot of the science. The way scientists think about it, the ones who think this way. Which, as I say, it's not all scientists who think this way. So they've got this idea that consciousness is due to programming, and when you have programming, it gets more and more complex. And eventually, when it's sufficiently complicated, and I'm a programmer, so I know what programs are like, they can get very, very complicated. The idea is that as it gets more and more and more complicated, in certain kind of intricacy arises, then suddenly, magically, you have consciousness. Well, and then they say we'll begin to understand how consciousness works once we can get these programs going that are sufficiently complicated. So just first little crack into that as to why one mightn't think that way. And first of all, is that when I prefer to think of it as awareness rather than consciousness. So when you see a very sudden bright light in your face, or you hear a very loud sound, or you get hit by something, you bump into someone, pain, or bump into someone in the street, these are moments when you suddenly wake up. And most people would say that those are moments of heightened awareness. And it's not when you're sitting reading some very complicated, intricate line of logic, or you doing some very complicated mathematics, or thinking through some very complicated scenario and trying to imagine some very complicated shape, then that's not when you are at your most aware, most people would say. So the way we experience it, it doesn't seem that it is complexity that we're experiencing as what is awareness. Of course, that's not going to work for your scientists. They're going to say, "Ah, yes, but it just seems simple to you, and there's something very complicated going on, and it's because what's going on is very complicated, even though it seems simple." But that's a little bit of kind of special pleading, as it were. They want it to be complexity that is awareness, so they're trying to interpret it as being complexity, even though it seems like it's simplicity. And then the other idea, well, they say that if it's a computer program, another thing that would kind of maybe put some chinks in this idea, well, DNA is nowhere near complicated enough to have the instructions for an entire program of something that does all the complicated things that human beings do. But even more than that, then you get behaviour of single cells. And single cells, amoeba and things, they don't have any neurons, they don't have a brain. They're less complicated than a neuron. And yet they can move around, they can search for food, they feel aversion, and so there's no way there could be a computer program going on in there. There's this idea that the neurons are connected together in a kind of network, and that through the electrical signals going through that, in some way there's like a computer program, like a computer, and that our consciousness is connected to some kind of computer program that is in the way all these electrical pulses are going around. But obviously that's not happening in an amoeba. And it would be very silly for our brains to be organised that way, because that would mean that we'd need hundreds of neurons in order to outthink an amoeba. It would be a very inefficient way of organising the brain. So I don't believe that our brains are like that either. I don't think our brains consist of that there are undoubtedly electrical pulses going on, and they undoubtedly do have some connection with the way we think. And that when you are asleep you get these sudden patterns of electricity in your brain. When you're awake you get different patterns. There's obviously electricity is connected with our experience. That there is some connection, there's some link between our brain and the way we experience things. And you get particular kind of patterns of electricity going on in the brain when you dream and so on. So nobody questions that. But I don't think that link consists of a computer program. And because it just, for one thing, well, I've given the reasons already, really. So, and then there's some other reasons as well as to why to think it's not a computer program, and that's the whole idea of truth. So, if you were to try and program something, if you write a program, you can write a program to behave in any way you like, in response to anything you like. And there's no reason at all for a computer program. You could program a computer to say that 2 plus 3 equals 7. And it would just write out, if that's what your program says, that's what it'll print out. It only does our computers only do mathematics correctly because we program it to do it correctly. And it'd be very easy to write a computer calculator that produces always wrong answers. And it's only because you've got human programmers there that our calculators work and are correct. And indeed, there was a kind of famous example of an early version of Windows calculator that produced wrong answers. And so if we were just computer programs, there's no reason why we need to understand truth. And yet we feel that if you say something is true, that you really do know it. I know that this is a table. I know that this is my Surface Pro tablet. I know that this is a keyboard or a mouse or whatever. I know that this is a mouse and so on. It's not that I've been programmed to say that that's a mouse. We have some intuitive idea of truth. And then when you take that to mathematics, then we understand numbers. And then once you understand what numbers are clearly, then you can see that 2 plus 3 equals 5. And then if you take that even further, then that's where you get to Professor Penrose's argument. And mathematics is particularly clear that you can look at truth through a very clear lens in the area of mathematics. And then so he has this argument, which it's a little bit intricate because it's in the area of logic and mathematics, and I talk about it in my article. And I'm not trying to get you to believe this argument and say, this is convincing, and you'd have to think about it a while to see that, or to come to your opinion on that. this argument he's done comes to the conclusion that it is impossible to write a computer program that can understand truth. Because as soon as you've got a computer program, you can then find the truth that computer program can never see, and although a human mathematician can. And it doesn't get around this problem to add things like randomness and so on. You still have this thing. So now he comes up with this thesis that truth is non-computable. And that means that there's no computer program, there's no simulation either. So if you try to simulate a human mathematician, all the atoms and all the electrons in some very advanced future computer, and then still you wouldn't be able to come up with something that can understand truth because it's non-computable. This means, if he's right, that there has to be something non-computable going on in the physics of my body. And there's no reason why all physics has to be capable of being simulated in computer programs. We make lots of simplifications, indeed, in order to make our simulations work. And so he's saying that a computer program can never completely simulate a human brain and a human body sufficiently so that the simulation will understand truth. So it's the antithesis of this idea of the hard artificial intelligence idea that sometime in the future that we will be able to upload ourselves as computer programs into a digital world, and from his argument that's just not possible. And so then this just hope this brings a kind of chinks to this idea that these people understand things. It's a belief, it's a hypothesis, but it's a hypothesis which they have elevated to a belief. Many people, the many people who call themselves scientists, who believe that sometime in the future we will be able to extract a computer program from a brain and put it into a computer. That is a belief. That's as much a religious belief, I would say, as the idea that you have an afterlife. And then also the idea that we will be able to find out what consciousness is by working out the program, and that then when you die, then it's just like a computer being destroyed and there's nothing left of the program. That is again, there's no scientific evidence for that. It's very hard even to know what could count as scientific evidence for that. That is a religious belief, I would call that. If someone says that, I'm 100% sure of that. That's as much of a religious belief as saying I'm 100% sure that there'll be an afterlife of some sort, or the ancestors worship, or the various, all the other ideas that people have about what happens when you die, and rebirth and reincarnation and souls and all these things. It's as much of a leap as that. And so then another way of looking at this, then another thing is this, a philosophical experiment, which I think a thought experiment, which you often do in philosophy. And I think that if we move forward and bring science to these other realms that science no longer currently is not able to deal with, then I think things like philosophical thought experiments, and maybe things you can do with your mind that are much more advanced than that, might be ways of moving into this new realm that science can't get into at the moment. And there might be something much more scientific than what philosophers are doing, and yet it isn't scientific in the sense of doing experiments, but more in the sense of how you work with your mind and how you think about things. But at the moment, we don't really know how to do that. Anyway, so I'm just going to present this thought experiment. And so the idea is that when you dream, then imagine that you had a very coherent dream. And in that dream, that you dreamt that we're going to make it it's like a dream in which you're a dream scientist. And in this dream, though, just to make it very clear that the distinction between the dream body and the dreamer's body, then in the dream, let's say that you dream that you're a butterfly. Like the famous Chinese philosopher who dreamt he was a butterfly, and when he woke up, he didn't know whether which he was, whether he was a butterfly dreaming he was a human, or whether he was a human dreaming he was a butterfly. So let's suppose that you're in this dream, and you have a very coherent dream in which you dream that you're a butterfly. But you're a scientific butterfly. And maybe a large human-sized butterfly in some extraterrestrial planet, like in the Doctor Who's Web Planet, which I've just been watching. So you're kind of these big science fiction extraterrestrial, and you maybe been watching that program, and then you go to sleep and you dream that you're a butterfly, an intelligent butterfly, and you can flap your wings and fly around. And then you could in the dream you could then examine your brain, and you would work out what things in your brain are connected with your wings and so on. And then you could maybe in the dream you damage your brain and you lose your memory, and then it becomes very clear to you in the dream that your memory is connected with your brain. And so you start thinking, oh well, my consciousness is in my brain. And you could do all the things that we do as scientists here that show this very intimate connection between your brain and your consciousness. And you could get other people in the dream to do EEGs and find out how your electrical rhythms in your brain depend on whether you're asleep or dreaming and so on. If you had a very coherent dream, you can imagine it doing all of that. So, and then you wake up. And you wake up to this body. So what happened to your butterfly's brain? And to all these experiments about your butterfly's brain? So if you believe that if you take the dream butterfly as being the reality, then your butterfly's brain has rotted away. When you wake up, presumably it died. But if you take this as being your reality, then what happened to your butterfly's brain? So that is like the way that scientists understand this body, and they say when this body dies and your brain rots away, that's the end of consciousness and awareness. But what if we wake up from this body to some other state? So I know that if you're a scientist, you'll probably just look at that with total bafflement and think, how could someone think such a silly thing as that? But maybe just give you a little bit of time to think. If you think about it, this is how philosophers think. And philosophers work in a very different way from scientists. You can't do philosophical experiments in the same way that you can do scientific ones. You don't solve all the questions in philosophy by doing measurements and doing careful experiments and things like that. You do them by these philosophical experiments, thinking about ideas. They're like experiments, but they're more stimulating ideas. And so then I thought I'd talk a little bit about the idea of rebirth in Buddhism. That's not because I'm trying to convince you that this is the truth, but just to show that it's something I happen to know about because I'm a Buddhist. So I'm more comfortable talking about that than the other ideas. I was Christian when I was young, but I've been Buddhist for much longer in this life than I have been Christian, I would think. I was Christian till my mid-20s, well, about the same, but I remember the Buddha. I thought through the Buddhist ideas sort of rather more coherently anyway, and maybe I could say a little bit about the Christian ideas, but I think Buddhist ones are easier for me. So then, with the idea of rebirth, it gets quite connected with this idea of waking up, which is why I talked about it, especially as it's described in Tibetan Buddhism. It's a little bit different depending on the branch of Buddhism that you're studying, and they have different ideas about what happens when you die. But with the Tibetan idea, then when you die, it's like you wake up. And you wake up to there's a long, elaborate process of how it goes on, and there's things about how you still some connection with this world and so on. But I'm just talking about the basic, simple idea, and I don't understand the complex ideas myself anyway. But the simple idea is it's very elaborate, and you'd have to do special study to understand all the details of that. But the simple idea behind it is that when you die, you wake up to a very bright light and huge sound, like 1,000 thunders, they say. Enormous sound, not like a disco, but something huge sound, like the loudest thunder you could imagine 1,000 times over, the brightest light you could possibly imagine, and then you waken up to that. Now, if you've got the right kind of preparation for that, that could be the moment that you wake up, properly wake up. Now, they say that could also happen while you're in this body, so it's not quite like waking up from a dream, in the sense you can actually wake up now. And they say at every single moment I suppose it is in a way quite like waking up from a dream. So in any particular moment, I could just wake up this very moment, because every moment this blindness, or this bright light, this very the vast openness of being awake is available to all of us in every moment, and that's how they think about it. And but it's you have a particularly clear connection of it when you die. And so when you die, then you get these bright lights, and then because you're so used to being in a body, and you for bodies after bodies after bodies, then you kind of try and push it away, and you go running away, and you go and look for a little hole to hide in. And they say that if you could just open out a little bit and just create a little bit of a gap there, tremendous insight could come from that. But it's really quite difficult to do that, and you end up just running away to your little rabbit hole, and that's when you could, depending on your previous proclivities, you go to different. You'd end up in different bodies as a result of that. So you rush away into your little rabbit hole, which is like when you have conception, when you take birth. And then you're in your mother's womb, and then you're born. And then if you think about this, now when you go back to when I was born, I don't remember when I was born. I think very few people remember their own birth. And I don't think anybody remembers, or it must be very rare if anybody does, remembers being in their mother's womb. And so how likely is it that you're going to remember all the way back to this bright blinding light and these huge sounds in between one life and the next, and lots of complex stuff that happened there, and then back through your death and to your previous life? So this is something that is going to be very, very hard to study scientifically, if it's true, because how can you study when you can't remember it? If you wanted to study it, then you could look at some of the Tibetan lamas, if they were interested enough to collaborate with you. Then when they die, then in the next life, it's said that through a lot of meditation and their a deep connection with these things, then when they die, then they're able to some extent they choose their next rebirth, and they talk about the Dalai Lama choosing his next rebirth, and then when they do that, then they're found as a young child, and then they test the young child for familiarity with the previous life. So it's not all Tibetans that do this. Most Tibetans, in fact, just about all Tibetans, will not remember their previous life, and they won't try to find out who they were in their previous life. That is, even the Buddha warned against doing that. So even if it was possible, they won't want to try. Because your average Joe, then it's not terribly helpful to find out who you were in your previous life. You get totally preoccupied and caught up with this a lot of stuff that is really not very helpful or productive at all if you did that. And it could actually be harmful. But for the kind of high lamas who great teachers, then they say that they can do this thing, and then they can follow it through to the next life. And this could be available to anyone. Anybody could do that if you had the dedication to do the meditation and follow the instructions and so on. Then anybody could do that. But in practice, very few people do. So if that's true, then when they come into the next life, then when they're a young child, then for a little while, then they remember enough of their previous life to actually see some familiarity in some of the objects that they knew in their previous life. Like I remember my cup that I always had, or whatever it was, and you show that to the young tulku, to the young child, and there'll be some familiarity. So that is something that you could conceivably maybe be able to study in something like our ordinary science, to try and see if there is some connection from one life to another. But the problem is that even if you prove that, that wouldn't prove rebirth. Because all that would show is that there's some kind of connection between Joe Bloggs Senior in the previous life and Joe Bloggs Junior in this life. That this Joe Bloggs Junior in this life has a familiarity with something that Joe Bloggs Senior saw in the previous life. And if you could somehow manage to prove some connection there, it doesn't actually prove that they're the same, that there's a continuous stream from one to the other. I mean, you could just as easily say that shows some kind of telepathy working forward through time or something. You could come up with all sorts of ideas of what it's all about. So it'd be very difficult to take that and then try to take that to a conclusion and say, therefore you have rebirth in the Buddhist sense of the word. And in the same way, I dare say that the people who do ancestor worship probably have very good reasons for believing that these are the ancestors that they're talking to. And perhaps even it turns out that there might turn out that there's something that science can actually deal with there and actually confirm some of the things that they say. Now, just supposing that that was the case, I don't know if it would be the case. That again wouldn't prove that that these actually are the ancestors, because this is something that is currently scientists isn't really able to tackle things like that. Just as science doesn't understand consciousness. It's just not amenable to science. We can't give these things masses, and we can't give them a volume, we can't say where they are, we can't give them a charge. None of the normal ideas of science really work in this realm at the moment. Whether in the future, some future development of our ideas, maybe something in between philosophy and science. I'm not saying it's impossible that we'll ever be able to understand what's going on here, but it does seem to be way, way beyond what we can do with our science at present. And I think it's important to realise that our science has developed slowly and gradually. So many people would think of Sir Isaac Newton as the preeminent scientist. But if you'd asked him, he'd have said he's an alchemist as well. He was very keen on alchemy. And he didn't have that distinction between science and alchemy back then. So this idea of modern science developed very gradually. Even into the 19th century, 20th century, I think it's still evolving. And if you look into philosophy of science, you realise there's a lot more to science than you realise if you're just brought up as a scientist and you're told this is how you do science, and you just learn how to do it. But if you think about it philosophically, it's really quite intricate and quite difficult to understand in some ways. And so I think science is still moving forward, and there's a lot still to happen, I think, in science in the future. And that whatever it might be, maybe 5 centuries from now, 10 centuries from me, 1,000 years from now, 1,000,000 years from now, it might be quite difficult to recognise it as what we call science now. So I wouldn't like to say that it's never going to be possible for science to answer these questions, or at least maybe they don't have answers. Maybe what you need are the right questions. Maybe it's a matter of clarifying your questions until you get to a point where the questions are clear enough that you feel you understand it, even though you haven't got any answers. And it could be that there's some powers of the mind, for instance, that you actually can do things with the mind that just as we do experiments with physical objects, and it was the matter of learning how to roll things down planes and hit things together and look at what happens when you do that. Well, maybe we've got to do the same thing with our mind and learn to do certain things with our mind. Well, this is an idea that comes up in science fiction. Arthur C. Clarke and his ideas that beings in the future would be able to kind of mould the world with their minds. One of his youngsters, in the end of his, what's called Fountains of Paradise, I think it's the one about the space elevator. And the very end of that, then he has one of the youngsters showing off to an extraterrestrial that's visiting Earth, and he just transforms himself into a little flame, and just out of exuberance, and the adult apologises to the extraterrestrial, saying, "Oh, this is just a youngster getting carried away." So, I mean, it might be in the future that our minds are like that, and the world becomes, in a certain sense, much more malleable than we realise is possible at the moment. There could be all sorts, that's just science fiction, but there could be all sorts of possibilities. So, I'm just saying that with science, you certainly can't prove that when you die, that's it. And we can't prove that when you die, that you are reborn in another life. We can't prove that when you die, that you have an afterlife, a heavenly state or hell state, or a pure land, or ancestors, or shamanistic ideas. We just can't prove any of these things. And I think there's nothing wrong with having faith there. But I think it's good to be a little bit open and realise that you haven't actually proved it. And that may actually help you. So some people really think, I believe in Allah, say, and they think this is very, very important to them. I think actually, if you believe like that, I think it actually helps you to see that to actually see clearly that it is a faith. And they actually value their faith a lot. So to see clearly that you haven't actually proved it, this both, I think, supports your own faith. Because there's a kind of value in actually having this kind of faith with these ways of thinking. But at the same time, it also gives you respect for other people who have other faiths. So you don't need to say, I only believe 99% in Allah, say, or 57%, in order to give a possibility for other people to follow the path of the Buddha, or to believe in the ancestors, or to believe in Jesus, or whatever it is that they believe. So you don't have to kind of not push your belief down in order to let other people have their beliefs. You can fully embrace and be engaged in what it is that you believe. And yet at the same time, you can acknowledge that you haven't proved it scientifically. It's never going to be proved like that, probably. And you've got these logical arguments that may be very convincing for you. You may be able to prove your belief to yourself. But if you were born as someone else, those proofs that you're using wouldn't work for them. As you can just see that there are perfectly intelligent, very careful thinkers in all the major world religions who think very, very carefully about what their religious beliefs are and how they work and so on. And they are just as convinced of their beliefs as you are of yours. And I think it really helps to recognise that. So I, as a Buddhist, I have many things that I believe and follow. Then there's a path that I follow. People talk about Buddhism as a path where you don't have to believe anything. In a way, that's true. That there's no creed. But there are certain things that you need in order to follow the Buddhist path. So the idea, I think the essential idea would be, if you ask me, what's the essential thing about the Buddhist path, would be the idea that there's a truth that can be seen. And a truth has to be seen, and it can't be worked out from a book and understood from a book. And that when you see this truth yourself, then somehow that then clears up a lot of stuff. And that seeing this truth is what the path is about. So you have a kind of faith that there's a truth to be understood, but not to be understood intellectually, to actually be seen. And that's somehow this truth that you see directly, and trying to trying to understand it intellectually in a way gets in the way of that truth. Now that is, I'm being rather clumsy in the way I explain it, because obviously I haven't seen that truth. It's just a faith. But there's, in order to follow the Buddhist path, you have to believe that the Buddha did have something that he was saying, that there was a truth that he was putting forward. You don't know what that truth is. You're trying to, you're following your path, and your path is in the direction of opening out and trying to see the truth the truth of your experience, of looking, and there's a truth that not even necessarily the truth that the Buddha found, but just that there is a truth that you can find. And so that is basically the faith in the Buddhist path, that there's some truth that you can see for yourself. And I say, not the truth that the Buddha saw for himself necessarily. You want to see what is really true. So who cares what the Buddha saw? But he inspired us to this idea that there is something that can be seen, and what matters is what I'm going to see. So that is the idea of Buddhism. Well, for me, I find that very inspiring, and so that's the path I want to follow. But that doesn't mean at all that I think other people should follow this path. It appeals to particular people. Maybe it depends if you're brought up as a Buddhist. Maybe it also depends a little bit something on a kind of personal inclination. And the way I described it probably particularly appeals to people who think the way I do, but the other ways, even of describing the Buddhist path and the many paths within Buddhism. and many ways of approaching it, and many ways of talking about what it's all about. So you need to respect all of those, and the world would be much poorer, I think, without, if you took away any of the major religions. All the major religions, Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, Shintoism, Taoism, Hinduism, of course, the Jains, I don't know, I don't want to, and various forms of ancestor worship and shamanism, and the paganism. Apparently, this is the one religion that the UK has exported to the world, actually originated here, is modern paganism. So for some people that's their path. And I think we need to respect this, that different people have different paths, and that they have different ways of understanding things, and that these help them to understand these and to deal with these questions which science can't answer at present. And for some people, science is the path, and they find a great deal of satisfaction in following science. And so you don't want to, if that's what works for them, then you don't want to say that they're wrong either. Now, you will obviously going to come across people who say that they're right and everyone else is wrong. So we also have to tolerate those people as well, as best we can. So that is a natural thing, and you can sort of understand yourself from your own experience. I mean, how easy it is to get totally convinced by something that you come to believe yourself. So we don't really want to go around trying to get everyone, I'm not trying to browbeat everyone into understanding that there are different paths and approaches, but maybe the best you can do is just to accept that there are other people who have these eccentric and silly ideas, and you can't possibly make, they're obviously wrong, as it were. And I'm the only one who's right and everyone else is wrong. So, I mean, there are of course people who think like that. But as long as we, maybe it's a bit idealistic to expect everyone to kind of respect and say, well, I have complete faith in my religion, this is the path for me. And, as far as I'm concerned, this is right, but other people can say that their view is right. And I think I think one way or another we of course have to live in a world in which other people have different ideas, and I think it is also perfectly possible to respect them, and not just respect them as people, but you don't need to say that they're deluded. You don't need to say that they're confused. You don't need to say that they're irrational. And I think that it's important to say that that is important for the scientists as well. For the scientists, that it's not productive to say that. You may secretly think that, but I think it's actually not actually true. So I think if anyone in any of these belief systems actually says that, then they're going beyond what they have available to them. But I mean, of course, I can't, for all I know, I mean, it could be that they're right. That of all these different religions, maybe the Wiccas, the pagans that I was talking about from the UK's export to the world, maybe they're the only ones of all of us. All right, who knows? I mean, but you just, all you can do is to follow the path that you're on, and do the best you can with the path you're on. And then, if you're following a path of compassion and openness, and opening out to others, and not blocking people off, and helping others, and developing compassion, then I think all the major religions have this as their basis. And I think that's the most important thing of all. That as long as it's developing compassion and wisdom, then really it doesn't matter too much what you believe and what you think. And if you are scientifically minded and you don't, and you think that when you die that's it, well, I mean, if you can live well in this world with that view and it works for you, then I think well, good for you. So anyway, I think that's all. I'll stop at that point. It's really as kind of talking, saying let's just be a little bit more tolerant about each other, and accept, just accept that people do have these different views and ideas and approaches, and that at the moment we don't have anything that is available to us that is convincing to all people in different beliefs and sciences and religions and philosophies and politics. And it doesn't seem too likely that this is going to happen any time in the next, few centuries or whatever. I'd be surprised. We'll see.